Chapter 8, Henry 1189, by Charles Oman. When Henry of Anjou, now a young man of 21 years, succeeded to Stephen's crown, he found the country in a most deplorable condition. The regular administration of justice had ceased, many of the counties had no sheriffs or other royal officers, the revenue had fallen off by a half, and the barons were exercising all the prerogatives of the king, even to the extent of coining money in their own names. A weak man would have found the position hopeless. A strong man, like Henry, saw that it required instant and unflinching energy, but that it was not beyond repair. Henry started with the advantage of an undisputed title. His mother, Matilda, had ceded all her rights to him, and Stephen's surviving son, William of Boulogne, never attempted to lay any claim to the crown. Moreover, the king had enormous resources from abroad to aid him. His father was long dead, so that he was himself Count of Anjou and Touraine. He had his mother's lands of Normandy and Maine already in his hands, but he had become the ruler of a still larger realm by his marriage. He had taken to wife Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine, whose enormous inheritance stretched from the Loire to the Pyrenees. This was a marriage of pure policy. Eleanor was an ill-conditioned, unprincipled woman, the divorced wife of King Louis VII of France, and she gave her second husband almost as much trouble as she had given her first. But by aid of her possessions, Henry dominated the whole of France. Indeed, he held much more French territory under him than did King Louis VII. PG 98 himself, and for the political gain he was prepared to endure the domestic trouble. The continental dominions of Henry were, indeed, so large that they quite outweighed England in his estimation. He was himself Angevin born and bred, and looked upon his position more as that of a French prince who owned a great dependency beyond sea, than as that of an English king who had possessions in France. He spent the greater part of his time on the continent, so that England was generally governed by the successive justiciars, or prime ministers, who acted as regents while he was abroad. Henry's absence and his absorption in foreign politics were perhaps not a very grave misfortune for England. He was such a strong and able ruler that when he had once put the realm to rights in the early part of his reign, the danger to be feared was no longer feudal anarchy, but royal despotism. Henry's first measures on succeeding to the throne were very drastic. He began by ordering the barons to dismantle all the castles which had been built in the troublous times of Stephen, and enforced his command by appearing at the head PG 99 of a large army. It is said that he leveled to the ground as many as 375 of these adulterine castles, as they were called, because they had been erected without the king's leave. Very few of the barons ventured to resist. Those who did were crushed without difficulty. Henry also resumed all the royal estates and revenues, which Stephen and Matilda had lavished on their partisans during the Civil War, annulling all his mother's unwise grants as well as those of her enemy. He filled up the vacant sheriffdoms, and commenced the dispatch of itinerant justices round the country, to sit and decide cases in the shire courts. This custom, which became permanent, was the origin of our modern assizes. After he had set England in order, Henry demanded the restoration of Northumberland and Cumberland from Malcolm of Scotland, the heir of King David. They were given back after being 17 years in Scottish hands. At the same time, Malcolm did homage to Henry for his remaining earldom in England, that of Huntingdon, which had descended to him from Waltheof. Owen, Prince of North Wales, submitted himself to the king in the same year, but not without some fighting, in which Henry met with checks at first. Thus England was pacified, brought under firm and regular rule, and restored to her ancient frontiers. Henry even thought at this time of invading Ireland, and got a bull from Pope Adrian IV, the only Englishman who ever sat upon the papal throne, to authorize him to subdue that country. The pretexts alleged were that the Irish Church was schismatic, inasmuch as it refused to acknowledge the papal authority, and also that Ireland was infamous for its slave trading in Christian men. But no attempt was made to enforce the bull laudabiliter for many years to come. Ireland might rest secure, because the king had turned aside into schemes for the augmentation of his continental dominions. Long and fruitless bickerings and negotiations with Louis Roman VII, the shifty king of France, ended in 1159 in the War of Toulouse. Henry laid claim to the great South French county of Toulouse, as owing fealty to his wife's Duchy of Aquitaine. He led against it the greatest army that had been seen for many years, in which the King of Scotland and the Prince of Wales served as his chief vassals. PG 100. But when Louis of France threw himself into Toulouse, Henry turned aside, moved, it is said, by the curious feudal scruple that it did not befit him as Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou to make a personal attack on his suzerain, the King of France. He ravaged the county, but did not proceed with the siege of Toulouse itself. Next year, he patched up a peace with his feudal superior, which was to be confirmed by the marriage of his 5-year-old son and heir, Prince Henry, with Margaret, the French king's daughter, 1160. The chief interest of the very fruitless War of Toulouse was that Henry employed in it a new scheme of taxation, which was an indirect blow at the feudal system. As Toulouse was so very far from England, he allowed those of the English knighthood who preferred to stay at home to pay him instead of personal service a composition called scutage, shield money. The money thus received was used to hire a great body of mercenary men-at-arms, whom the king knew to be both more obedient and more efficient soldiers than the unruly feudal levies. The interest of Henry's reign now shifts round to another point, the question of the relations between state and church, which we have already seen cropping up in the reigns of Rufus and Henry I. In 1162, he appointed Thomas Becket Archbishop of Canterbury, and rued the choice ever after, for now his troubles began. Thomas, the son of a wealthy merchant of London, had been the king's chief secretary or chancellor for the last 8 years. He was a clever, versatile, not very scrupulous man, with a devouring ambition. Hitherto he had been a devoted servant and a genial companion to the king, and had lived much more like a layman than a cleric. In spite of his priesthood, he had borne arms in the War of Toulouse, and even distinguished himself in a single combat with a French champion. Henry thought that Thomas would be no less obliging and useful as archbishop than he had been as chancellor. He was woefully deceived. No sooner was Thomas consecrated than his whole conduct and manner of life suddenly changed. His ambition, now that he had become a great prelate, was to win the reputation of a saint. Casting away all his old habits, he began to practice the most rigid austerity, wearing a hair shirt next his skin, stinting himself in food and drink, and washing the feet of lepers and PG 101 mendicants. From a supple courtier, he had become the most angular and impracticable of saints. But it was not merely to mortify his own body that Becket had accepted the archbishopric. His real object was to claim for the head of the church in England what the popes of his day were claiming for themselves in Western Christendom, complete freedom from the control of the state. His dream was to make the English church imperium in imperio and to rule it himself as an absolute master. Without the reputation of a saint, he could not dare to compass this monstrous end, so a saint he had to become. The moment that he was consecrated, he opened his campaign against the king. He threw up the chancellorship, which Henry had asked him to retain, and commenced at once to vindicate the rights of the See of Canterbury. That is, to lay claim to a number of estates now in the hands of various lay owners, as being church land. When his demands were withstood, he in some cases went to law with the owners, but in others used the arbitrary clerical punishment of excommunicating his adversaries. But this was only the beginning of troubles. In 1163, he began to oppose the king in the Great Council, taking up the ever-popular cry that the taxes were overheavy. Henry, surprised at meeting opposition from such an unexpected quarter, withdrew his proposals, which seem indeed to have been intended rather to limit the profits of the sheriffs than to raise more money. But the growing estrangement between the king and the archbishop did not come to a full head till the end of 1163, when they engaged in a desperate quarrel on the question of the rights and immunities of the clergy. We have mentioned in an earlier chapter how William the Conqueror had established separate courts for the trial of clerical offenses and had put them under the control of the bishops. Since his day, these courts had been steadily growing in importance and putting forth wider and wider claims of jurisdiction. The anarchical reign of Stephen, when all lay courts of justice came to a standstill, had been especially favorable to their growth. The last development of their demands had been the extraordinary assertion that they ought to try, not only all ecclesiastical offenses, but all offenses in which ecclesiastics were concerned. That is, not only were such PG 102 crimes as bigamy or heresy or perjury to come before them, but if a member of the clerical body committed theft or assault or murder, or, again, if a layman robbed or assaulted or murdered a cleric, the cases were to be taken out of the king's court and to be brought before the bishops. The most monstrous absurdity of this claim was that the ecclesiastical tribunal had no power to impose any but ecclesiastical punishments, that is to say, penance, excommunication, or deprivation of orders. So if a clergyman committed the most grievous crimes, he could not receive any greater penalty than suspension from his clerical duties, or penances which he might or might not perform. It had come to be a regular trick with habitual criminals to claim that they were in holy orders, which included not only the priesthood, but sacristans and subdeacons and other minor church officers, and so to exchange death or blinding for the milder ecclesiastical punishments. A very bad case of murder by a priest, which Becket punished merely by ordering the murderer to abstain from celebrating the sacraments for 2 years, called King Henry's attention to the usurpation of the church courts. When he found that their claims were quite modern and had been unknown to the Old English law, he resolved at once to take in hand the settlement of the whole question of the ecclesiastical courts. At a great council held at Westminster, he proposed to appoint a committee to investigate the matter and to draw up a statement of the true law of the land with regard, not only to criminous clerks, but to all the disputes between lay and clerical personages which could arise. Becket opposed the proposal as an invasion of the rights of the Church, and by his advice the other bishops, when asked if they would undertake to abide by the decision of the committee, replied that they would do so in so far as it did not impugn their rights, which meant not at all. The statement of the laws of England was prepared by the committee, drawn up by the justiciar, Richard de Lucy, and laid before the Great Council at Clarendon early in the next year, 1164, whence the document is known as the Constitutions of Clarendon. The king in it proposed a compromise, that the church court should try whether a criminous clerk was PG 103 guilty or innocent, and, if it pronounced him guilty, should hand him over to the king's officers to suffer the same punishment that a layman who had committed a similar offense would suffer. In other matters, where a layman and a cleric went to law on secular matters, the case was to be tried in the king's court. No layman was to be punished for spiritual offenses or excommunicated without the king's leave, and the clergy were strictly prohibited from making appeals to Rome or going thither unless they had the royal authorization. Becket declared that the constitutions of Clarendon violated the immunities of the Church, but for a moment he yielded and consented to sign them. Next day, however, to the surprise of all men, he asserted that his consent had been a deadly sin, that he withdrew it, and that nothing should induce him to sign the constitutions. Henry vehemently urged him to do so, and pointed out that the Archbishop of York and the rest of the bishops were ready to accept the arrangement as just and fair. But Thomas took the attitude of a martyr, refused to move, and even sent to the Pope to get absolution for his so-called sin in giving a momentary consent to the king's proposals. Seriously angry at the archbishop for binding up his cause with that of the criminous clerks and the usurpation of the church courts, Henry took the rather unworthy step of endeavoring to bend Thomas to his will by allowing several of his courtiers to bring lawsuits against him, and by threatening to rake up and go through the accounts of all the public moneys that had passed through his hands during the 8 years that he had been chancellor. But Becket was not a man to be bullied. He made himself yet more stiff-necked, and assumed the pose of a martyr for the rights of the Church. It was in vain that the other bishops urged him to yield. He attended the Great Council at Northampton in October, 1164, faced the king, refused to submit, and then, pretending that his life was in danger, fled by night and sailed over to Flanders. For the next 6 years, Becket was on the continent, generally under the protection of Henry's suzerain and enemy, the King of France. He was regarded by the continental clergy as the champion of the rights of their order and treated with the highest respect wherever he PG 104 went. He did his best to stir up the King of France and his vassals against Henry II, and to induce the Pope Alexander III to excommunicate him. But Alexander, deep in a quarrel with the great Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, did not wish to make an enemy of the strongest king in Western Europe, and refused to do Becket's behest. On his own account, however, the exiled archbishop laid the sentence of excommunication on most of Henry's chief counselors. As the great body of the bishops sided with the king, Becket's fulminations from oversea had little effect. In England he was treated as non-existent. But in 1170, a new complication brought about a change in affairs. King Henry's eldest son and namesake, Henry the Younger, was now a lad of 15, and his father wished to crown him and take him as colleague in his kingdom. The right to crown an English king was undoubtedly one of the prerogatives of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but Henry left Becket out of account and caused the ceremony to be performed by Roger of York. This invasion of his privileges wrought Thomas to such fury that he sought out the Pope, and won him over by his vehemence to threaten to lay all England under interdict, to cut it off from Christendom, and forbid the celebration of the sacraments within its bounds. King Henry, who was engaged in a troublesome war with the French king, was afraid of the consequences of the papal interdict. Its enforcement, he thought, would make him too unpopular. So he humbled himself to patching up a truce with Becket, though they could not even yet come to any agreement on the question of the constitutions of Clarendon. In the autumn of 1170, the king allowed him to return to England, on a tacit agreement that bygones were to be bygones. But Becket had hidden his true purpose from the king. He returned to England bent, not on peace but on war, either because his anger carried him away, or because he was deliberately aiming at martyrdom and wished to provoke his enemies to violence. He proceeded to the most unheard of measures. He first excommunicated the Archbishop of York and the bishops of London and Lincoln, who had taken part in the crowning of the younger Henry. Then he laid a similar PG 105 sentence on those of the king's courtiers whom he accused of encroaching on the estates of the See of Canterbury. The king was still oversea in Normandy when the news of Becket's declaration of war was brought him. Henry was a man of violent passions, and the tale moved him to a sudden outbreak of fury. "Of all the idle servants that I maintain," he cried, "is there not one that will avenge me on this pestilent priest?" The words were wrung from him by the excitement of the moment and soon forgotten, but they had a disastrous result. Among those who heard them were 4 reckless knights, some of whom had personal grudges against Becket, and all of whom were ready to win the king's favor by any means, fair or foul. Their names were Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard the Breton. These 4 took counsel with each other, secretly stole away from the court, and crossed the stormy December seas to England. They rode straight to Canterbury, sought audience with the archbishop, and bade him remove the excommunication of Roger of York and the rest, or face the king's wrath. Thomas met their words with a fierce refusal. Thereupon they withdrew after defying him and warning him that his blood was on his own head. While they were girding on their coats of mail in the cathedral close, the monks of Canterbury besought the archbishop to fly. He had plenty of time to do so, but flight was not his purpose. Far from hiding himself, he called for his robes and his attendants and went to join in the vesper service at the cathedral. The knights were soon heard thundering at the door. Becket threw it open with his own hands and asked their purpose. "Absolve the bishops or die," cried Fitzurse. "Never till they have done penance for their sin," was the reply. Tracy cast his arms about the archbishop and tried to drag him outside the cathedral, but Thomas cast him down. Then Fitzurse drew his sword and cut at Becket's head, and the others felled him with repeated strokes, while he kept crying that he died for the cause of God and the Church. So ended the great archbishop, slain by lawless violence on the consecrated stones of his own cathedral. The splendid courage with which he met his death, and the brutality of his assailants, persuaded most men that he must have been in the right. The clergy looked upon him as their PG 106 knight and champion, and were only too ready to make capital out of his troubles and heroic end. The poor remembered his indiscriminate almsgiving, his austerities, his opposition to the danger. Every class of men felt some respect for one who had suffered exile and death for loyal adhesion to a cause, and few, except the king, thoroughly realized that the cause had really been that of ill government and clerical tyranny. Hence it came that a man whose main characteristics were his ambition and his obstinacy, and whose saintliness was artificial and deliberately assumed, took his place in the English calendar as the favorite hero of the church. The Pope made him a saint in 1174. A magnificent shrine was erected over his remains, and for 350 years pilgrims thronged in thousands to do homage to his bones. To relate how many hysterical persons or impostors gave out that they had been healed of their diseases by a visit to his sanctuary would be tedious. The thing which would have given Becket most pleasure, could he have lived again to view it, was the sight of Henry II, doing penance at his tomb in 1174 and bearing his back to be scourged by the monks of Canterbury, as a slight reparation for the hasty words that had brought about his servant's deed of murder. There is no doubt that Henry was sincerely shocked and horrified by the news of the archbishop's death. He sent instant messages to the Pope to clear himself of the accusation of having been privy to the crime, and offered any satisfaction that Alexander might demand. Meanwhile, he undertook what might be considered a kind of crusade to Ireland, with the avowed purpose of reducing it to obedience to the papacy, as well as to subjection to himself. For during the times of Becket's exile, 1164-70, 2 important series of events had been occurring, one of which put Henry in possession of Brittany, while the other had led to his interference in Ireland. The Dukes of Normandy had always claimed a feudal supremacy over Brittany. This claim Henry found an opportunity for asserting and turning to account by forcing Conan, the Breton duke, to marry his infant heiress Constance to his own 3rd son Geoffrey, a boy of 7 years old, 1166. When Conan died 5 years later, Henry ruled the whole duchy as guardian of his young son and daughter-in-law. Thus his PG 107 power was extended over the whole western shore of France from the Somme to the Pyrenees. Henry's interference in Ireland sprang from more complicated causes. Ireland in the 12th century was, as it had been since the first dawn of history, a group of Celtic principalities, always engaged in weary tribal wars with each other. Sometimes one king gained a momentary superiority over the rest, but his power ceased with his life. In the 9th century, the island had been overrun by the Danes. They had not succeeded in occupying a broad Danelagh such as they won in England, but had built up a number of small kingdoms on the coast, round their fortified strongholds of Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, and Limerick. These principalities still existed in Henry's time, while the interior was held by the five kings of Ulster, Munster, Connaught, Meath, and Leinster. At this moment Roderick O'Connor of Connaught claimed and occasionally exercised authority as suzerain over the other kings, but he had no real power over the land, which lay half desolate, had become altogether barbarous, and teemed with cruel and squalid tribal wars. The introduction of this distressful country into English politics may be laid at the door of Dermot MacMorrough, King of Leinster. This prince had been driven out of his realm by his suzerain, Roderick, King of Connaught, because he had carried off the wife of Roderick's vassal, O'Rourke, Lord of Breffni. Dermot came to England and asked aid of Henry II, who, as we have already seen, had long possessed a papal bull, authorizing the conquest of Ireland. Henry would not stir himself, being in the midst of troubles with the King of France, but gave the exiled king leave to obtain what help he could from the English barons. Dermot placed himself in the hands of Richard de Clare, nicknamed Strongbow, Earl of Pembroke, a warlike but impecunious peer who had great influence in South Wales. Richard raised a small army of Anglo-Norman knights and Welsh archers, less than 2,000 men in all, and landed in Ireland to restore Dermot to his throne. He met with quite unexpected success, sweeping Dermot's enemies out of Leinster and conquering the Danish princes of Wexford and Dublin. He married Dermot's heiress Eva, and on the king's death in 1171, succeeded him as ruler in PG 108 his kingdom. Other barons and knights from South Wales came over to join him, and they obtained a complete mastery over the native Irish, whose light-armed bands could not resist the charge of the mail-clad knights or stand before the archers, even when they were in overwhelming numerical superiority. In a battle before the gates of Dublin, a few hundred followers of Strongbow routed the whole host of Roderick of Connaught, though he was supported by a considerable body of Danish Vikings. Now, Henry did not wish to see one of his vassals building up a great kingdom in Ireland, independent of his authority. So, taking advantage of the papal authorization that he had so long kept by him, he crossed himself in 1171 with a great army and fleet, landed at Waterford, and marched to Dublin. He had no trouble in getting his authority recognized. Not only did Strongbow do him homage for the kingdom of Leinster, but, one after another, most of the native Irish kings came to his court and paid allegiance to him. From henceforth the kings of England might call themselves Lords of Ireland, but their power in the island was not very easy to exercise, nor did it extend to the remoter corners of the land. About half the soil of Ireland was seized by English and Norman adventurers, who built themselves castles and held down the Celts around them. The other half, mostly consisting of the more rugged and barren districts, remained in the hands of the native chiefs. But the settlers in the course of time intermarried with the Irish and adopted many of their customs, so that they became tribal chiefs themselves. A century later, the grudge between the settlers and the natives was still bitter, but they had become so closely assimilated that it was hard for a stranger to distinguish them. The one were as turbulent, clannish, fierce, and barbarous as the other. Only on the east coast round Dublin, in the district that was afterwards known as the English Pale, did the Anglo-Irish dwell in a settled and civilized manner of life, and obey the King of England's mandates. The larger part of the island had to be reconquered 4 centuries after. Perhaps the only permanent and immediate result of Henry's visit to Ireland was the submission of the Irish Church to the Pope. In a synod held at Cashel in 1172, all the bishops of the PG 109 land acknowledged the papal supremacy and abandoned the old customs of their church. Thus the papal yoke was the first and most unhappy gift of England to Ireland. It was on his return from Dublin that King Henry met the legates of Alexander Roman III. At Avranches, in Normandy, and on swearing that he had neither planned nor consented to the murder of Becket, was taken into the Pope's favor and received complete absolution. In return, he promised to go on a crusade and swore that he would support Alexander against his enemy, the Emperor Frederick I. He also consented to annul the constitutions of Clarendon, but did not make any formal surrender of the principles on which they rested: the right of the state to deal with ecclesiastical persons guilty of secular offences. Thus ended the tragedy of Becket's strife with the king. The archbishop had obtained by his death what he could never win in his life, and the question between church and state was left open, instead of being settled, as had at first seemed likely, in favor of the king. In less than a year after the penance at Avranches, Henry was plunged into a new sea of troubles, in which the church party saw the vengeance of heaven for the fate of Becket. All these troubles sprang from the undutiful conduct of Henry's sons, four graceless youths who had been brought up in the worst of schools by their able but unprincipled mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry, the eldest son, was now in his 19th year, Richard, the second son, in his 17th. But in spite of their youth, the two boys, encouraged and supported by their mother, conspired against their father and king. In 1173, Henry fled to the court of Louis of France, alleging as his grievance the fact that the king would not grant him a great appanage, England or Normandy, to rule in his own right. With the aid of Louis VII, the young Henry stirred up all the discontented elements in his father's dominions. He arranged for a simultaneous rising of the discontented barons of Brittany, Anjou, and Poitou, for a rebellion in England to be headed by the Earls of Leicester, Derby, and Norfolk, and for an invasion of Northumbria by William, the King of the Scots. This widespread conspiracy actually came to a head, but its outbreak only served to show King Henry's strength and PG 110 activity. He was himself in France when the storm burst. Taking in hand the work that lay nearest to him, he put down the Bretons and Angevins, and forced the King of France to conclude a truce. Then, in the winter of 1173-4, he turned upon his son Richard's partisans in Poitou, and after much fighting, pacified the land. Meanwhile, the king's representative in England, the justiciar Richard de Lucy, had called out the levies of the shires against the revolted barons. The campaign was settled by a battle at Fornham, in Suffolk, where the rebels were scattered and the Earl of Leicester taken prisoner. One after another, the castles of the disloyal barons fell, and when England was pacified, Ralph de Glanville led a force against the Scots, surprised them at Alnwick, and took their King William the Lion prisoner, 1174. Thus Henry had triumphed over all his foes. In the moment of victory, he showed extraordinary moderation. He neither executed any of the rebels nor confiscated their lands, but only insisted that all their castles should be demolished. He gave his sons a full pardon, and restored them to his favor. With their mother he was far more wroth, and never would live with her again. The King of the Scots was only released on doing homage to the English crown, not merely for his earldoms of Huntingdon and Lothian, which had always been reckoned English fiefs, but for his whole kingdom of Scotland, 1175. This was Henry's greatest triumph. The danger of feudal anarchy had once more assailed him, and he had beaten it down with such a firm hand that England was never troubled again with a purely selfish and anarchic baronial rising for more than 2 centuries. But this victory did not win the king a quiet and glorious end to his reign. His wicked and ungrateful sons were to be the bane of his elder years. The effect of the blow that he had dealt his disloyal subjects lasted about 8 years, a period of quiet and prosperity on both sides of the Channel, during which Henry passed many excellent laws, and more especially dealt with the administration of justice, arranging permanent circuits for the itinerant justices who sat in the county courts to hold the assizes. He also issued regulations for the uniform arming and mustering of the shire levies, the old English fiat which had served him so well against the PG 111 rebels in 1173. Abroad he was universally recognized as the greatest king of the West. He was chosen as the fairest arbitrator in several disputes between contemporary princes, even by the distant kings of Spain. He married his daughters to the kings of Castile and Sicily and the great Duke of Saxony, the chief vassal of the German crown. To each of his sons he promised a great inheritance. Henry was to have England, Normandy, and Anjou. Richard was to take his mother's portion in Aquitaine. Geoffrey was already provided for with his wife's duchy of Brittany. John, the youngest son, was to be king of Ireland, and the Irish chiefs were made to do homage to him. All this prosperity lasted when Henry was 52, and his 4 sons respectively 28, 26, 24, and 16. Tired of waiting any longer for his inheritance, and forgetful of the warning that he had received in 1174, Henry the Younger once more took arms against his father. His aider and abettor was the new king of France, Philip Augustus, the son of Louis VII, as bitter an enemy of the Angevin house as his predecessor had been. Henry also persuaded his brother Geoffrey to bring in the Bretons to his aid. Richard and John, the king's second and fourth sons, were for the time being faithful to their father. Indeed, the actual casus belli, which Henry the Younger published as his justification, was that the king had unfairly favored Richard against him. This time the fighting was all on the continent. The English baronage were too much cowed to stir. Henry the Younger had only been a few months in rebellion when he died, stricken down by a fever, 1183. But the civil war in Aquitaine did not end with his death. It dragged on its path till Geoffrey, his accomplice in the rebellion, was accidentally killed at a tournament 3 years later, 1186. Henry had no issue, but Geoffrey left an infant heir, the unfortunate Arthur of Brittany, whose sad end was to shock the succeeding generation. Henry's two rebellious sons being dead, peace was for a time restored in his continental dominions. Men's minds were turned away for a time from civil strife by dire news from the east. The Saracens had just routed the Christian king of Palestine and recaptured Jerusalem. The work of the First Crusade was undone, and the PG 112 Holy Sepulchre and the True Cross had fallen back into the hands of the infidels. The nations of the West were profoundly shocked. King Henry, his eldest surviving son Richard, and his great enemy Philip of France, all swore to take the cross and go forth to save the wrecks of the kingdom of Jerusalem from Saladin, the victorious lord of Syria and Egypt. All their baronage vowed to follow them, and the Great Council of England voted for the support of the new crusade a heavy tax, the Saladin tithe, as it was called, which was to be a tenth of every man's goods and chattels. This was the first impost levied on personal property, that is, property other than land, which was ever raised in England. Previously, the Danegeld and the other taxes that had been raised were calculated on landed property alone. It would have been well for the King of England if his son and his French neighbor had sailed for the Holy Land in the year that they made their vow. For another and crowning, grief was about to fall upon Henry. Richard, now his heir, revolted against him, even as Henry the Younger and Geoffrey had done 4 years before. Like his elder brother, Richard alleged that his father would not give him enough. He complained that the king did not allow him to be crowned as his colleague, and that he made too much of John, the youngest and best loved of his 4 sons. The ungrateful conduct of Richard broke Henry's heart. Though only 56 years of age, he began visibly to fail in health and mind. He made little endeavor to resist his son, and allowed him to overrun Anjou and Maine unopposed. Instead of calling out all his energies and appealing to the loyalty of his English and Norman subjects, he cast himself upon his couch and gave himself up to passionate grief. Rather than take arms against Richard, he determined to give him all that he asked. So, rising from his bed, he dragged himself to Colombières, where he met Richard and the King of France and swore to grant all they claimed. It was noticed that his bodily weakness was so great that his servants had to hold him on his horse, while the interview was taking place. 2 days later he expired. The final death blow that prostrated him was the discovery of the fact that his youngest son, John, whom he had believed to the last to be faithful to him, had secretly aided PG 113 Richard and joined in the rebellion. For when he swore to pardon all Richard's accomplices and was given the list of their names, he found that of John set at the head of the catalogue of traitors. "Let things go as they will. I have nothing to care for in the world now," he said, and turning his face to the wall, gave up his spirit, July 7, 1189. So died Henry of Anjou, whom after ages styled Plantagenet. He was an Englishman neither by birth nor by breeding, and the greater part of his reign was spent abroad. 2 years was the longest continuous stay that he ever made on this side of the Channel. But, foreigner as he was the best king that England had known since Edgar, or that she was to know till Edward I. That he ended the awful anarchy which had prevailed since the accession of Stephen was a merit that should never be forgotten. When the feudal danger was at its greatest, he boldly faced it, ended private wars, pulled down illegal castles, and reduced the baronage to its due obedience. And when the land was subdued beneath his hand, he ruled it justly, not as a grasping tyrant, but as a wise and merciful master. Among the kings of his day, he was conspicuous for 2 rare virtues: a willingness to pardon and forget, and a determination to stand firm by the letter of his promise. He had his faults: a hasty temper, a far-reaching ambition, a tendency to deal with men as if they were merely counters in the great game of politics. Nor was his private life entirely free from blame. But he loved order and justice so well, and gave them in such good measure to his subjects, that his virtues must always outweigh in English minds his occasional lapses from the right path.